1 week season.
Hey, welcome in, OWS fam. So glad you are with us. We are back in the lab, the DFS lab, as always, presented by 1 week season. The purpose of this show, build a DraftKings lineup and use that as a way to talk through the upcoming slate. In this case, we are looking at a showdown. It is Monday morning, November 11th, just around 9 a.m. Eastern when we are recording this, 6 a.m. Pacific. And tonight it is the Miami Dolphins at the LA Rams. Rams 2.5-point favorites. I'm your host, Cheeseman, and it is my pleasure, as always, to welcome up Xandamere. Xandamere, how was Week 10? How's it going? All that good stuff.
Oh, it's going great, man. Week 10 was an absolute bloodbath.
Same here.
Got destroyed. I feel good about how I played it. I just, it was a weird week. It was a super low scoring week. I think the Millie Maker on DraftKings was won by a score, and I think the 170s. Which I don't have years of data in front of me, but I'm not sure I can ever remember seeing that. Winning scores are almost always over 200, very rare to be under, and that's way under. So just really weird week. A lot. I mean, if I'm trying to think of a chalk play that really hit, what play at ownership hit?
Yeah, I mean, maybe Brock Purdy if he was the highest owned quarterback, but other than that,
he was. But the problem is none of his receivers hit. So
right.
Unless you're running Brock Purdy naked, who is, Ricky Pearsall the closest. I guess John Jennings, Ricky Pearsall did fine, right? Especially Jennings on DK because of the PPR format. But no one, they didn't smash, right? So that's probably the closest you've got to a chalk play that hit is Purdy. But chalk running backs Aaron Jones, Alvin Kamara, Bijan Robinson was owned, right? He smashed. He wasn't unowned. But almost all the chalk running backs failed. Chalk wide receivers like Josh Downs, Khalil Shakir, Lab McConkey, everyone. It's just absolute bloodbath.
Yeah, and so many games just didn't go how we expected. Even with the Falcons, with Bijan Robinson, he scored 2 touchdowns, but they were trailing most of that game. Yeah. And so that's not a game script you expect him necessarily to smash. He had a 37-yard touchdown and then a 1-yard touchdown run. But then the Minnesota Vikings, Sam Darnold ended up throwing, I think, the most pass attempts he has all season because for some reason they could not score against Jacksonville. Yeah. First team all season, they can't score against Jacksonville. So,
and none of the Vikings wide receivers had a good game because he threw
Darnold
passes.
Threw 3 picks.
Yeah. And then, how about Jared Goff last night throwing 5 picks and the Lions winning? That's insane. It's just a weird week of football, right? And that's going to happen. And sometimes every week you have some weird games, right? Because it's a highly variant sport. And then a couple times a season, you're going to have those weird games end up getting clumped together on one week. And you're just what happened? I will note, though, that for the Falcons, Bijan Robinson is actually the odd running back who is a better play in close games or when the Falcons are down. Because when the Falcons are playing from ahead, they split his work more with Tyler Algier. When the Falcons are playing from behind, Bijan's on the field almost all the time because he's the pass catching back, and they don't really use Tyler Algier in the pass game. So Tyler Algier gets game scripted out when the Falcons are playing from behind. So he is the odd running back who's actually better in trailing scripts. But also he got so lucky to pay, which you're going to have to, right? You're always going to have to get lucky to find ceiling, but they had 4 carries in a row from the 1-yard line. They gave Tyler Algier the first 3, which if you've watched the Falcons, you can be annoyed by it, but you should not be surprised by it, right? That happens all the time. And he didn't manage to get in the end zone, and they gave Bijan Robinson the 4th down carry and he converted. And it's funny, people say oh, it's, of course you have to give it to your best player there, blah, blah, blah. And I get that. And there's some truth to that. But at the same time, most of the, from a 1-yard carry, it doesn't really have a lot to do with the ability of the running back. It's much more to do with what play is called and how effectively does the line block, right? It's not really about the running back. So he got lucky that Tyler Algier was not able to convert on 3 consecutive 1-yard attempts, and then he got a touchdown. He got the touchdown that way. So he still would have had a good game, right? He still would have had 100 yards and a touchdown, which on this slate would have made him the highest. I think he was the only running back to get 20 points. Oh wait, James Conner got 20 points. So right. 2 running backs got to 20 points. I want to say 3 wide receivers or 2. George Pickens got to 20 points, barely missed the bonus, which is he was my highest wide receiver, and somehow I didn't win all the money. And then Marcus Valdez-Scantling got to 20 points. And then Terry McLaurin was like right around. I don't know if he got 20 or not. I don't think he did. I think he finished a little under. But like that scoring is just wild. I think, the only tight end who had a good game at all was like Travis Kelce, who got something like 18 or 19 points, which is still not great for his salary, but it was just the high score at the position. Like every other tight end flopped. TJ Hawkinson did okay. George Kittle did okay. But like just an insane week of wildly low scores. So, and sometimes those weeks turn out great, right? Like sometimes those weeks turn out really great. Like I'm a somewhat contrarian player, but like I'm generally not going to fade like all the chalk. That's just not my play style. And you can win with a lot of different play styles. People have often looked for like what's the best way to play DFS, and like you can win. Utica is one of the best players in the world, and he often credits his success to saying, "I'm not a." He's like, "I don't play the best plays. Like I just don't play the best plays, and I win on weeks when the best plays fail." And that's a totally viable approach to play DFS, right? It's a highly variant one because some of the best plays generally hit most weeks. So it's a highly variant way to play. He has the bankroll to sustain it. Other people are much chalkier players and they play more of the quote unquote best plays and they find smaller ways to differentiate. There's lots of paths to success. And on a given week, whether you hit is about what path you chose, but over the long term, you can hit, you can win and be profitable with any of those strategies. It's just about learning and executing your strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like that. And, I wanted to ask you kind of one other thing that you guys talked about I think it applies well to this week before we get into the showdown build. Again, it's the Dolphins at Rams tonight, but you and Hilo talked on the Slate podcast, which is 1 week season inner circle. In my opinion, the best podcast in the industry in terms of like, Saturday afternoon, like let's get ready, let's dive in. And, but anyway, you talked about just how to measure your results, especially if you're a tournament player, because, being a tournament player only, you can have a lot of weeks that are down or just total loss. And so if you could kind of recap kind of like that, what you said about measuring your results and how to know if you're doing it right.
Yeah. So, okay. I do think this is a valuable conversation because in our space, one of the things we hear about all the time is process over results, right? Process over results. And it's a good mantra. The problem is it doesn't actually tell us anything useful in and of itself, right? Process over results. What does that mean? Well, it means you should focus on your decision-making process and on making good decisions, not on the results of a given week. Makes sense. But how do you know if you're making good decisions? And so this is the rub, right? Like because everyone out there is going to say, oh, I feel like the process was good. And I got to focus on process over results. But if you're making bad decisions, all that's going to do is it's going to reinforce continuing to make more bad decisions. And so you have to think about like, well, how do I evaluate my results? And let me rephrase that. How do I evaluate my process in an objective way, absent results? Yep. Because it's really easy to just be like, oh, I played this play and it didn't work out, but it was good process. Was it? Was it? Like, for example, let's look at a couple plays from this last week. We liked Saquon Barkley as a very high ceiling running back early in the week, or actually, and even through late in the week. I would argue, and he is a very high ceiling running back. However, I would argue that as the week went on, you started seeing a lot of Saquon Barkley talk throughout the industry, and so it started to be clear that his ownership was going to be a little higher. Look, at the start of the week, at midweek, it looked like he was going to be very overlooked. I mean, I kept bumping his ownership up and up throughout the week. But at the start, my first round of ownership projections, he was sub 10%. By the end, he was like 14, I think. That's something around there. And so the question is like, 2 down backs. He's mostly a 2 down back. His passing game role is not huge because the Eagles don't pass a lot. They don't, especially in a game they control, which we projected them to control as over touchdown favorites against Dallas. Now, he still has an enormous ceiling. The Eagles scored 5 touchdowns or 4 touchdowns. He just didn't happen to get any. But that doesn't make him a bad play. What it means is he is a volatile play. 2 down backs are inherently volatile plays because they are highly dependent on getting into the end zone and hitting the 100-yard rushing bonus. Saquon has a good chance of doing both those things, right? But he didn't do it. Again, that doesn't mean he's a bad play. It just means he's a volatile play because without, like, A, he's expensive, so you need more points from him. And B, if he doesn't have a strong pass catching role, he doesn't have that sort of floor booster of, well, at least he can catch some passes. Alvin Kamara, for example. Alvin Kamara also failed, right? But he still got to 15 points because his pass catching role is enormous. He only got like 55 rushing yards, and he didn't find the end zone, but he still scored 15 points. Alvin Kamara scored 30 points last week without a touchdown, right? He's a more high floor back. Saquon's ceiling is enormous, but his floor is very low, as we saw this week. So was he good process? I don't know, right? Like, I think he wasn't bad necessarily, but as you know, playing a highly volatile play into ownership is different than playing a highly volatile play at low ownership. One of my mantras is volatility at low ownership, not avoid volatility at high ownership.
Yeah.
Let's take another example. Will be Christian McCaffrey. I said on the slate that Christian McCaffrey was the single best play on the week, right? I said he was wildly underpriced. Normally, a healthy Christian McCaffrey is 9.5 to 10K salary. He was 8K. He was in a good matchup. The 49ers had the highest team total on the week. We know he's an awesome player. They're also missing Brandon Ayuk, right, who's out for the season. So the question was, what is his workload going to be, right? And so we didn't know, right? And I was saying this in Discord all morning. People were like, oh, this beat reporter said this and this beat reporter said that. It's like, we don't know. At the end of the day, we don't know. It's likely that Kyle Shanahan didn't know, right? It's likely that they had an idea, but they were going to see how he responded, right? They had no idea. My take was, given how long they held him out, I thought it was more likely than not that he was pretty much going to be a normal workload. But more importantly, I wasn't trying to predict the future. What I was really thinking was, if he gets a normal workload, he is absolutely hands down the best play on the slate at 8K.
Yep.
If he doesn't get the normal workload, then he loses. But there's good plays lose all the time, right? It's like that's not a downside to me. You can find lots of good plays and good spots that lose. But if he gets a normal workload, he's an absolute smash play at this price. Well, Christian McCaffrey played 90% of the snaps. He handled 90% of the running back opportunities. If I told you that before the slate, if I told you that on Sunday morning that he was going to play 90% of the snaps and handle 90% of the running back opportunities, his ownership would have been 40% instead of like around 15, 20%, right? Because
that would have been low. That would have been low for what he should be. Yeah.
Yeah. But he just didn't hit, right? The 49ers really struggled. The 49ers led. The 49ers punted once. I think they had either 8 or 9 drives, and all but one drive, they at least made it into field goal range. So they were marching the field. They just really struggled, as they have often done this season, in converting into touchdowns. And so the hope was, I think, Christian McCaffrey being back would help them to be more efficient at converting into touchdowns. The Bucs defense was also a favorable matchup. So, it just didn't work out. That's an example of where I would say that was clearly good process. It just didn't work out. Yeah, and I'll do one more before we can move on.
Yeah.
Which is, the guy of the week, Marquez Valdes-Scantling. So, there was some conversation in our Discord about this, and I said something like, in hindsight, hindsight's a bitch, right? But I said, in hindsight, like, I should have considered him more. And somebody was like, well, yeah, but doesn't that feel kind of results oriented? And I thought about it for a while, and I said, I don't think so, and here's why. I think that we should have. One, it was a cheap wide receiver week. Right? Like, if there weren't a lot of cheap wide receivers projecting for ownership, then you could easily say that, wow, you consider this random punt dude. But on a week, there were like a bunch of cheap wide receivers projecting for ownership, right? We had Noah Brown, we had Adonai Mitchell, we had Mac Hollins, we had even Calvin Austin, the Bucs guys. Yeah. So like the people needed value, and wide receiver was a value position. So there was like a lot of rosters were going to have at least one cheap wide receiver on them. And so, okay, so that's one part. That's one piece of context. And so, because cheap wide receivers are volatile, cheap wide receivers are always volatile, right? Like they're very volatile plays. They're not the wide receiver ones on their team generally. They're like, you're hoping they get either a target spike or efficiency on a small number of targets. But like, they are highly volatile plays. And so, again, go back to play highly volatile plays at low ownership, not high ownership. Marquez Valdes-Scantling had been on the Saints for a week. He played 40% of the snaps last week. The two guys who played above him were Bub Means and Cedric Wilson, who were both hurt. So basically, like, they were down to Mason Tipton, who had done really nothing so far in his NFL career, and Marquez Valdes-Scantling, who has honestly not done a lot in his NFL career. But I even made some comment on the slate with Hilo. We were talking about cheap wide receivers. I said, like, oh yeah, what about like MVS? I mean, he hasn't been on the team very long, but how long does it take to learn his route tree, which is basically run straight, turn once? But then I kind of didn't consider him more than that. And it's like, I should have, because he was going to be on the field. He's basically playing the Rashid Shaheed role, which we've seen be successful in the Saints offense as the deep threat receiver. Like, we know Derek Carr can throw a long one. You can find him. The matchup wasn't exceptionally tough. It was a relatively high total, close spread game. But the most important thing was just he was a cheap wide receiver who was going to be on the field a lot on an offense that didn't have a lot of established options outside of like Kamara. So it was reasonable to see him getting some targets. He's a high value per target pass catcher because of his, he caught 3 passes, but 2 of them were, one was for 40 yards, one was for 60 yards or something like that.
That's his profile. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, he doesn't need a ton of volume to hit if he catches the ball, which is obviously a risk for him. He doesn't catch the ball very well, but if he does, so basically there were all these cheap wide receivers on the slate who were super, super fragile plays because they were all going to get 3 to 6 targets and low touchdown equity. Like Marquez Valdes-Scantling did not profile that differently from most of those guys, really. Like in terms of his projection, like they're all projected within a point or 2 of each other, right? Which is like 1 catch. So we should have considered him more because he was going to be on the field for an offense projected to score a decent number. The Saints team total is like 21. It's a decent team total on this week, right? So projected to be on the field a lot for a decent offense and a decent matchup. But more importantly, like everyone's playing a cheap wide receiver. So everyone's expressing a high degree of confidence they can figure out which cheap wide receiver is going to hit. As we know, we've had cheap wide receiver weeks before. This is not the first cheap wide receiver week we've had in the history of DFS, right? Like these happen sometimes throughout the season where there's, you need the value and people are trying to pick this, from this dartboard of cheap wide receivers. And we know that it's really hard to do that successfully. We know that they are highly, highly volatile positions. And so why play the guy at 15 or 20% ownership when you can play a guy who's really not that different at 1%? And I'm not trying to say that he was some smash play. We should have locked him on all of our rosters. He wasn't, right? All I was trying to say is he should have been in the player pool with the other guys like Mitchell and Tipton and, the Bucks guys and Mac Hollins. Like he should have been in the player pool with those guys because he's not that different from those guys. So that's another way to process over results. Now, in terms of measuring it, and this bit's important, like it's really hard to measure based on wins because wins are rare. So like first place, like big wins, right? Those wins are rare. Yeah. It's also not so great to measure based on caching because in tournaments, you can play too conservatively where you have a higher than normal chance of cashing, but a lower than normal chance of winning. Right. And so just looking at your cash rate is a bit of a mirage, right? Like if you just want to win by cashing, play cash games. There's a whole format out there for you. And that's what you should, if that's what you're good at, you can make plenty of money playing cash games. But in tournaments, you got to think about, well, how do I evaluate my play? And so, and this is not like I can't claim credit for this idea, right? But one methodology that has stood out in the last couple of years and become popular is measure how many of your lineups you're placing in the top X% of a tournament. 1%, 2%, 5%. I wouldn't go past 5% because then you get into the problem of playing for cash rate, not playing for wins. 1% is good because generally a roster in the top 1% generally needs like one big break for it to have a chance at actually winning. Mm-hmm. And that's what we want, right? We want to put ourselves in a position where we just need that one last break in order to win. And so if you have a decent sample size of rosters from this year, from your whole DFS career, you can look at what percentage of rosters are you placing in the top 1% of tournaments. And there are bankroll trackers that will do this for you, right? The Solver has a good bankroll tracker that you can upload your contest history and it will graph that for you. And so that's a good way to tell how you're playing. And so you need more than 1% of your rosters in the top 1% of tournaments over a large sample to say, I'm playing well. Like at least 1.2%-ish because there's rake, right? But if you're placing more than 1.2% of your rosters in the top 1% of tournaments, then over time you should do well. It's just a matter of sitting back, continuing to do what you're doing, and waiting for the variance to swing your way. As long as you're doing that, I would feel comfortable saying my process is good. I need to wait on the results. If you're placing 0.7% of your rosters in the top 1% of tournaments, and that's over a sustained, significant sample size, like don't look at it based on 1 week, right? But if you're doing that over a significant sample size, then it's probably time to think, hey, maybe my process isn't as good as I think, right? And if I just keep saying process over results, then all I'm going to do is I'm going to reinforce making bad decisions. And so I need to actually consider what to change. So that's a really good way to measure your results and try to put some objectivity into the whole process over results, mantra.
Yeah, exactly. I love that. I've heard that before as well. And I've been using that like over the last, couple years, I would say. And I mean, I would say, like take the time, either find a good bankroll tracker or just, you can actually go into DraftKings and download a spreadsheet of all your entire entry history. If you honestly wanted to like see how much you've won or lost over the entire career of playing, that can be fun or not fun based on different factors. But yeah, just go in and just see, over the last 1,000 lineups, like how many have I placed in the top 1%? And sometimes it can actually be really helpful because it's like, hey, I actually didn't realize this, but I'm actually placing, more than I thought in the top 1%. So it can really help you to either solidify or just step back and say, actually, I clearly am not doing something right. So it's time to reevaluate. I think it's something that everyone should do if you're serious about trying to, hit a win, in a DFS tournament, which is really kind of, that's where the upside is in this industry. So great stuff, Xandamere. Let's jump into DraftKings here. And I've already got the lineup for tonight pulled up in the hard count 3-entry max. So yeah, what's your initial thoughts? It's a 2.5-point favorite for the Rams, who are at home. So really a pretty close in terms of the spread, and a pretty good total as well. I mean, two teams with certainly some explosive pieces and not like necessarily great defenses.
Yeah, the Dolphins defense has held up reasonably well in not allowing a ton of points.
True.
But it feels like a bit of a mirage because they're not generating turnovers. They're not getting at the quarterback. They have 10 sacks in 8 games. That's atrociously bad, right? Like they're doing a pretty good job of like limiting red zone possessions, forcing the team to march down the field. But like, that's not super sustainable to me, right? Like if you cannot interrupt drives with sacks or turnovers at some point, like it's hard to keep the other team out of the end zone forever. The Rams are a bit more aggressive defense, but they're just not as good as they used to be, right? Like they've lost Aaron Donald. They're just not as good as they're just not as good as they used to be, right? Like they used to be elite.
Yeah.
So I don't know, like the Rams are generating more in the way of turnovers. I have a hard time seeing, like, I think they're a bit of a mirage as well. They're allowing 24 points per game. It's not great. The question is the Dolphins offense to me, because the Dolphins offense, like we used to generally think they are so good. They're so fast, right? Like they're incredible. They can score on anyone, blah, blah, blah. This year they've looked kind of okay in games Tua has started, right? Like week 1, they only put up 20 at Jacksonville. Week 2, Tua played the majority of the game. They put up 10 at Buffalo. Week 3, 27 at Arizona. Everyone puts up 27 at Arizona. Last week, like they're kind of coming around a little bit. Like 27 against Buffalo last week is much better, but like they're kind of coming around. But they haven't been as explosive. And specifically, I'm talking about when Tua starts, of course, right? Not when Tyler Huntley's starting. But like they haven't been as explosive as we were used to seeing in the last couple of years with Tua. They've also got Tyreek Hill, who's been playing through a wrist injury apparently all season. We just recently learned, and apparently he's been playing through pain the whole season. He has not been what we've expected, right? He has one game over like 15 DK points. And again, obviously he played some games with like Tyler Huntley, which sucks. But even with Tua, he's only got one good game. So is the wrist injury affecting him, or is it a small sample size and variance? Like, I don't know. He's the important thing is he's a game time decision. And so he could sit, right? Like if he sits, this slate changes enormously. But right now with him in, the hard thing about the slate right now is it is extremely top heavy, right? The Rams offense basically runs through Kyren Williams, Puka Nacua, and Cooper Kupp, right? Like when all those guys are healthy, that is the Rams offense. No one else does much of anything.
Yeah.
At least not predictably. The Dolphins offense has been running through Devon Achane and Tyreek Hill. And to some extent, Jonnu Smith, interestingly. Jalen Waddle has like Jonnu Smith has more targets in the season than Jalen Waddle. Poor Jalen Waddle is the best wide receiver. He might be the best wide receiver 2 in the league. He's certainly up in the conversation. And yet for some reason, like he's just not throwing the ball at all. So you have this weird top heavy slate where like you've got this like group of studs and quarterbacks at the very top, kind of going from Kyren Williams down to Puka Nacua. And then you scroll way, way down and you've got like the kickers and you've got, Jonnu Smith. And the value plays on this slate are just like past that are really thin because these offenses just are so top heavy when everyone's healthy. Like Colby Parkinson, the Rams TE1, actually came in second in snaps last week, and like he's kind of vanishing from the offense now that Puka and Kupp are back. He had 0 targets last week, 2 targets in each of the previous 2 weeks, right? It's like we're just seeing like these offenses be so concentrated that like it creates this really top-heavy dynamic in the slate. And so because of that, there's basically 3 ways to build rosters in this slate. One is you try to avoid I'm defining the slate when I say like value. I'm defining that as cheaper than Jonnu Smith. I think Jonnu Smith is at 4,400 is the sort of lowest tier full-time offensive player, right? Like not some bench guy, a guy who is reasonably involved in the offense with 6+ targets each of the last 4 weeks. So he's like the lowest tier like guy who's fully involved in the offense. And there's the kickers there, and the defense is a little below them, which are obviously always viable.
And then you get a punt territory.
Yeah, everyone below that is like this total punt who literally like everyone below that legitimately has a floor of 0 points. And so you can try to build a roster that doesn't use any of those punt guys, right? You can try to build a roster that uses 0 punts, which I think is a viable approach. You can try and build a roster that tries to find the right punt, because someone down there is going to catch a pass or 2, and sometimes if the guy's cheap enough, it only takes 2 or 4 points. I have in fact seen a showdown tournament win in which someone has 0 on the roster, right? Because the scoring was so top heavy that it just resulted in having a 0 was good enough to win.
I've tried that. Yeah, it didn't work for me when
it generally doesn't work well. Yeah. It generally doesn't go well.
Yeah.
But anyway, point being, like there's just it's like the punt play thing is hard. The third way is try to sort of build more like all more mid-tier. And so like if you're going the sort of scrub the stars and scrubs by context of this slate where you're going into like the kickers, Jonnu Smith, and defenses, that's still kind of in the context of this slate a stars and scrubs lineup. Or the other way is you kind of try to avoid that by captaining a cheaper player instead of captaining one of the studs and hoping that the cheaper player is a good enough game to make him the optimal captain by allowing you to not spend down as much somewhere else. There's also one really weird dynamic in this slate because there is one lineup, like really precisely one, where you can play 4 of the sort of stud tier players without, and one of them at captain, without going below Jonnu Smith. And that lineup is really quick. It's Puka, it's Devon Achane. It is, oh God, where'd it go? Now I have to remember it. It's the Rams kicker, it's Jonnu Smith, and then it's Matt Stafford and Tua, right? So like that lineup is going to be, it's the only possible way to get 4 of the studs with one of the studs at captain, and then not go below Jonnu Smith. So that lineup will be popular.
Do you remember who's the captain on that one?
Yeah, it's Puka.
Okay.
Because Puka's, if you look at the pricing tier of the expensive guys, like Puka's the lowest price of the studs.
Yeah.
Not including Matt Stafford, who's hard as it's quarterback, pocket passer quarterbacks are tough on DraftKings. They're very rarely optimal. So that's going to be a common construction because Puka is objectively somewhat underpriced. That's what happens when you don't play last game because you deck somebody. I'm guessing the pricing is working in like the punching risk. I'm not sure. But it's hard to get, like, you can't get like Kyren or Tyreek Hill in that construction if you, right? Like you don't even have enough salary to get Tyreek Hill or Cooper Kupp. You have to play the 4 cheaper of the 7 sort of top tier plays in order to make that work. So those are that's the kind of the dynamic of the slate, the pricing dynamic of the slate. And so I think approaching it in all those ways is viable. For the purposes of this show, I'm going to approach it through the cheaper captain. And by the way, all this blows up if Tyreek Hill is out, of course, right? Like that opens up salary. Jalen Waddle becomes viable, much more viable. Jonnu Smith becomes much more viable. It adds in like Malik Washington and maybe even Odell Beckham as plays that are no longer complete punts. It makes Achane really strong. Like, so it just obviously it just changes a ton if Tyreek is out. But we're going to say for now Tyreek is in. And so I'm going to go who I think is this. I think this guy is the cheapest viable captain who has legitimate ceiling, both in raw points and in point per dollar points, which on DraftKings is often enough. And I'm going to build a Jonnu Smith captain roster.
Let's go.
And so, Jonnu he's always been a talented pass catching tight end. He, has 6+ targets in each of the last 4 games. He started the season kind of slow. But 6 plus targets each of the last 4 games at 4,400, like that will play. He's the cheapest guy who I can viably say, like, it would shock me if he didn't get at least 4 targets. Everyone below him, it would not shock me at all if they got 1 or 2 targets. So he's the cheapest guy that I think has the kind of ceiling that is necessary at the captain spot. And that allows us to afford, a lot of salary to play into, the script we want to make of a high scoring game. And so, sorry, now I'm just double checking my build to make sure I had it right, because I've gone this way. I've gone back and forth on this a couple of times.
Yeah, Jonnu, I like it. He also has great yak ability, yards after catch. So, broken play here. You want that possibility. If you roster someone, a broken player, or just something random happens, that he could benefit with, a bigger outcome than even expected.
Yeah, and so there's a lot of ways you can build from now, which is super exciting. Like, right, there's a lot of ways you can build to go around this lineup. Now you have choices of lots of the different stud captains, and so there's 2 sort of dynamics in play. One is that it's hard to get Tyreek Hill and Kyren Williams on a roster together, and so at some point I will very intentionally try to make Kyren plus Tyreek rosters, because just the nature of the pricing makes it difficult to fit them both together. So I'm definitely assuming Tyreek is in. I'm definitely going to try to, but on this roster, I'm not. On this roster, I'm going to end up skipping Mr. Hill because I want to play Kyren Williams. Kyren Williams is so expensive that I think that on a slate without a lot of clear value, there's a good chance that actually leads to him being a little bit under-owned. Not a ton. All the stud guys are going to be owned, right? But I think there's a decent chance that Kyren could come in a little bit lower than expected. And so I want to put Kyren Williams in here. Right, good matchup. Red zone role is absolutely monstrous.
Huge.
He has gotten 18 plus carries in all but 1 game this season, which is legitimately that's insane. That's insanely good. He has 10 touchdowns on the season. His role is just he might currently have the best running back role in the NFL. Actually, Alvin Kamara probably does because of all the injuries in the Saints, but Kyren's definitely up there.
Yeah.
And so I think. He's 10-8, so he's really expensive, and there's so many other studs around that I think it might be hard for people to stretch to get to him, and so I want to make sure that I'm really prioritizing him.
I love that, dude. I love that thought process.
Next is, and I'm sort of hoping Tyreek Hill plays in this lineup, and next one I'm going to put in is Achane. And so I mentioned that I want to have a lot of Tyreek Hill if he plays, and I do, but I think that one dynamic here to consider is the Dolphins, their offense is so concentrated currently that it's hard to see both Tyreek Hill and Achane failing unless the Dolphins just get absolutely dumpstered, right? Their offense is so concentrated through those 2 guys. Achane is playing the sort of RB1A role. He's not getting 20 carries, but he's going to get 10 to 12. And he's also playing he's kind of playing the wide receiver 2 role, right? Lately. I mean, that's what they've realized is he's kind of their most explosive player overall, except for Hill. And so they're trying to and it's not just he's getting a lot of targets. Sometimes you see running backs get a lot of targets. He's lining up as a wide receiver a fair bit of the time. He's sometimes running routes as if he were a wide receiver. He's not running running back routes starting from behind the quarterback. He's lining up out wide a fair bit. So I think that I'm probably going to try to make sure I have either Tyreek Hill, Achane, or Rams defense on most of my rosters, if not all of my rosters, because I think it's if the Dolphins are competitive, one of those 2 guys is hitting. If the Dolphins aren't competitive, Rams defense is hitting. Being my thought process.
No, that is fantastic. Good stuff, man. This is. I like how this is going. Yeah.
So I'm going to do Achane. Now. You can see I still have 7,700 left. Now we have this weird void in the mid tier right now of pricing. It's Raheem Mostert is overpriced. He's an RB2. He's overpriced at 7,400. He's getting 8 to 10 carries a game and maybe a target. He's just overpriced. He needs to vulture at least 1 touchdown or have a big breakaway run or something. He's just overpriced there, and it's not that you can't play him, right? Ends up being a pay up to be contrarian play because no one's going to play him because of where he's priced. But I think he's a pay out to contrarian offer. He's a very good play, by the way, if Hill misses, I think. You've got Jalen Waddle at 6,600, who's a really tough. Jalen Waddle has 38 targets in 8 games. I don't know what the Dolphins are doing, but they're just not using him.
Targets a game, yeah.
Which is wild.
It's bad.
So Then you've got Demarcus Robinson, who had a big game last week, but like overall, when Cup and Puka are healthy, he doesn't tend to be highly involved, right? Like it's hard for him to get volume on the Rams offense. So there's this void in the mid tier of pricing. And so we know that we're going to, I shouldn't say we know. For me, I generally want to avoid that tier. And so I'm going to come down and find the next value play. And we're just going to plug in a kicker. And so let's just plug in the Rams kicker because he's $200 cheaper.
There we go.
Cool.
All right. Yeah. So now we got some more room at the top.
Yeah. And so now what we see is like who looks in play right now. We have 9,200. And the plays that we can get, we can't get Cooper Kupp, right? Because that would leave us with 8. I'm sorry, that's not true. I lied. Math is hard in the morning. We can get Cooper Kupp. If we get Cooper Kupp, we have to get Matt Stafford, right? And that's viable. We can't get Tyreek Hill without going into the mid-tier void. So basically, we can choose Cooper Kupp if we choose Matthew Stafford, or we can choose any two of Tua, Puka, and Matt Stafford. So I do think that as a somewhat like contrarian way to approach this, like you could build Kupp and Stafford and say, hey, because I played Jonnu at captain, like I don't necessarily need Tua. And what I mean by that is like normally you like to have the quarterback. Like I try to prioritize the quarterback if I have their pass catcher at captain, right? Generally speaking, if a pass catcher has a big game, that's points for the QB. But when I say because it's Jonnu's cheap. And so Jonnu can be the optimal captain without necessarily generating a ton of points for Tua. Like if Jonnu gets 5 catches for 60 yards and a touchdown, there's a solid chance he's the optimal captain. But that's not a ton of points for Tua. That doesn't necessarily mean he's dragging Tua along with him. So I do think that you can play, like I'm more likely to play the quarterback at captain when it's a higher tier pass catcher. Like if Tyreek Hill has a big game, that's like over 100 yards and a touchdown, maybe like 150 yards and 2 touchdowns, that kind of thing. And that means that he's generating a lot of points for Tua and probably dragging Tua along with him. But I'm willing to play this without Tua. But in this lineup, I think I'm going to try to keep it a little more straightforward. And so say I have Jonnu Smith, I have Devon Achane, who has been more of a pass catcher than a running back. So I kind of have 2 Dolphins pass catchers. And on the Rams side, I currently don't have a pass catcher. I have Kyren and I have their kicker. So my overall passing production does tend to lean more Dolphins in this build. So I'm going to put in Tua. And now my choices are either Puka Nacua or Matt Stafford, right? And so again, you could play Stafford here, and you're hoping in that case that he gets some passing game production, but it's spread out, and so Puka doesn't outscore him, right? But also it's also spread out that Kupp doesn't have a huge game either, and that Kupp isn't optimal. It just gets spread out. I mean, maybe Kyren catches a receiving touchdown, right? Like. So he's caught a couple this season. So that's viable too. But in this lineup, I'm going to go Puka. And I think that Puka is just objectively a little bit underpriced. Puka and Kupp are very, very similar plays. If you look at Puka's showdown salary history, 9,800, 10.6, 10.2. And then he, got ejected mid-game, and down to 9K. So like, I think that Puka at a discount is, and this is not going to be a sneaky option, right? Like I think people will see this, but Puka at a discount is, I think, a strong play. And I think that I've already hopefully differentiated this lineup enough by going with Jonnu Smith captain, which I don't think is likely to be super popular. So I'm hopefully I've differentiated this lineup enough that I can play like kind of the chalk conclusion to the lineup, which is the chalk conclusion. The last 2 plays of Tua and Puka were the obvious ones. The reason I talk through all the other options is because, like we've been talking about, if you're building a portfolio of lineups for Showdown, you could take this basic construction and then manipulate it different ways to get some different outcomes. Another way I'd be interested in playing this is I think Rams D is a pretty solid play at their price. And again, in the context of the slate where we just don't have a lot of value plays, I think that makes the defenses even stronger. And so coming down from the Rams kicker to the Rams D is another way to manipulate this construction and let you get to like Tyreek Hill and Cooper Kupp more easily. Right, like you can if you go to Rams D, you can play 2 of 3 of Kyren, Kupp, and Hill, which is otherwise pretty hard to do. So This is like my favorite basic construction lineup for this slate, and then we'll see how it goes. We'll see what happens to Tyreek Hill. Right, of course that's the big question, but this is my favorite. As of now, this is my favorite sort of basic construction of how I'm gonna approach the slate, and then we'll and I'll build permutations off of it.
Love it, man. Love it. For the podcast, you guys listening on there, we landed on Jonnu Smith, the captain, with Kyren Williams, Devon Achane, Cardi, the kicker for the Rams, Joshua Cardi, Tua, and Puka Nacua. But again, you could, if you, like Xandamere just said, you could take Cardi out, put the Rams defense in, and then you could swap out Tua and get either Kupp or Tyreek Hill. Xandamere, great stuff as always, man. I mean, guys, you could go back and listen again to Showdown starting from week 1. You would get so much more than just the games. I just love how you talk through the strategy elements in this. And I'm probably gonna go back and try to re-listen to this because I think I'll try to play it. And I just, especially after yesterday, I'm like, man, I just need to try and just just kind of reset, recharge the batteries and just reset the whole system, and hopefully it can get something going tonight. So great stuff, Xandamere.
Side note, I think it's funny that we both and almost everyone in the industry refers to Tua as Tua because no one can pronounce his last name correctly.
Yeah, exactly. It's just it's kind of like in the NBA with Giannis. It's Greek freak. It's ABC. It's just like
Antetokounmpo. Come on, Antetokounmpo.
Well, yeah. I mean, I could have pronounced that as well, but I just
I know what you mean. Everyone calls him ABC or Giannis.
There's so many abbreviations for players with difficult to pronounce names, and I love that about this industry.
Yeah. It's funny. And this will become a running joke on the show with me and Hilo, where I suck at pronouncing names.
Yeah.
Well, it's like, how do you for that?
No, they
or
are
Hemostare or something like that. I believe it's a joke. But Tua, by the way, is Tagovailoa. It's pronounced tug, not tag. Okay,
Tagovailoa. Yeah. I if you had asked me, I probably would have thrown out something close, but it might not have been perfectly accurate. So. Yeah, man, I know the names are fun. It's a fun element of this, but anyway, man, great stuff. Good luck tonight. You playing tonight?
We'll see. Hopefully, I will be playing if Tyreek.
Are you playing NBA? Are you going to play NBA tonight?
Well, so now Mondays I take my daughter to choir practice, and so if Tyreek is in, I will be able to build rosters and have them ready to go. If Tyreek ends up being out, I will probably withdraw because I won't have time to rebuild.
Just too much to have to rethink. Exactly, that makes sense.
A lot of moving pieces, and it's with multiple sports and in real life, it gets to be a lot sometimes.
It does, man. It does. Well, Xandamere, have a good one, man. Thanks for joining us, and we'll catch you next time.
Take care.